Greetings all and welcome to Daily Pali Reading. Today we're going to delve into taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And we will get to what all of that means. We are reading from the Kudakapata, Buddhaṃ saranaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranaṃ gacchāmi, Sangham saranaṃ gacchāmi. Now typically this would be repeated a second and a third time. I go to my shelter, the Buddha. I go to my shelter, the teaching. I go to my shelter, the community. Now, I've purposely translated this a little differently than you might be used to hearing it, and we'll talk about all of that in just a minute. First, let's notice that we have two types of words in this chant. We have a verb, which is in red, and then we have these words in blue, which are nouns, and not only are they nouns, they are objects of the verb. Let's start with the verb. Gacchāmi is the first person singular present active indicative of gacchati. And when I say of gacchati, I mean that gacchati is the form that we need to look up in the dictionaries. Pali dictionaries list verb forms by the third person singular present active indicative. We have gacchāmi, and we just need to know that that is first person singular. One way to remember this, if it seems difficult, is that in English, I and me refer to the same person, and we have gacchāmi. So that can help. So the verb means to go, or in this case, I go or I am going. Now let's look at our words in blue here in the first line. We have Buddhaṃ and saranaṃ. Now these are both in the accusative case. Buddhaṃ we know is in the accusative case because the only place where ung shows up is as the accusative. Saranaṃ is slightly different because it is a neuter word and its nominative and accusative are the same, ung. But we actually know it cannot be the subject here because the subject is built into the verb. We already said it's first person singular. The subject is I. If that were expressed, it would be ahang. Now you might think that it's sort of interesting or odd that we are calling these objects because the verb is to go. And in English, we don't treat go as a transitive verb. And a transitive verb means a verb that takes an object. You could hit something and you could pick something up. You could smell something, touch something. But we don't usually go something. We go to something. So in English, that would be intransitive. We would need a preposition. In Pali, the object of motion is actually expressed as a direct object. It's expressed in the accusative case. And actually in English, there is one example I can think of. If you say, I'm going home, that's one example. We have the exact parallel construction, which I'm sure goes back to Proto-Indo-European. So we have I am going, and we have these two objects. So there's a couple of different ways we can think about what's going on here. The sort of technical term is to say that these words are in apposition. They are referring to the same entity, maybe we could say. They're almost functioning as adjectives. We could say something like, I go to the Buddha, my refuge, my shelter. Who is my shelter? Or you could say, I go to the Buddha as a refuge. Something along those lines. So that when I first encountered apposition, I usually tried to just stick the word as in. But you could also say something like, I go to the Buddha, my shelter. And it might seem weird that I'm using the word my here, but in Pali, since the subject of the verb is I, it's first person, I don't have to use a possessive pronoun because it can just be understood that that's mine. If I were going to your refuge or shelter, then I would have to use some personal pronoun or possessive personal pronoun. We could take that either way. I like to get away from the use of the word refuge because I don't think that we, on average, I didn't look this up in like Google Words or anything. I feel like people use the word shelter more than refuge. I could be wrong about that. Really, I think saranaṃ could be like a house or something, so some kind of protection. I go to my protection, the Buddha. Or I go to the Buddha, my protection. I think those make perfect sense. And that also captures the apposition quality. You don't, in this case, if you use the word my, we don't need any other kind of word. If you aren't comfortable with the word my, we could simply say something like, I go to the Buddha as a shelter. And I think that also perfectly captures what's going on. Now, the beautiful thing about this passage is the next two lines are grammatically parallel. They're exactly the same. We only change the beginning word. So in the second line, instead of Buddhaṃ, we have Dhammaṃ, which according to the Pali English dictionary is masculine, but sometimes rarely neuter. And so the construction's exactly the same. I go to the Dharma, my shelter, my protection. I go to my shelter, the Dharma. Now, the Dharma is a technical term. And when you hear people use that expression, technical term, what they mean is it's a word that maybe shouldn't be translated. That's debatable in this case because I don't know that everyone who hears the word Dharma knows what it means. If you're certain that your listening or reading audience is very familiar with the term Dharma, then I would say by all means, let's use Dharma, or Dhamma would actually be the Pali word to use. If, on the other hand, it's possible that the listenership will not understand Dharma, then we might specify what Dharma is, which in this case is the teaching. So I go to my shelter, the teaching. I go to the teaching, specifically the teaching that the Buddha transmitted, that the Buddha taught, the teaching of the Buddha. And then in the last line, Sangha. This is another term that sometimes you'll hear not translated. So you might hear, I go to the Sangha of monks or bhikkhus. Bhikkhu's another one that after you hear it a while, you just realize bhikkhu means monk. But the Sangha, we could translate it as the community. I go to the community, my refuge, my protection, my shelter. So that's basically the grammatical breakdown. I should say, I mentioned before, this would be repeated 3 times. The second time when it's read, it's usually each of these lines is preceded by dutiyampi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranaṃ gacchāmi. And then the third time, tatiyampi. And we might understand that as dutiyaṃ samayaṃ, like a second time. Also a second time, I go to the Buddha, my shelter. Now we should also add that sometimes you might hear this expressed as, I take refuge in the Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. I take refuge in the Sangha. And this allows us to talk about what our goals are when we translate. Roughly speaking, we can either translate literally or we can translate in a way that gives the meaning in a very clear way. If you think about the expression, I go to the Buddha, my refuge, or as a refuge, I imagine someone has thought that in English, we don't often go to something as a refuge, but more often than not, we take refuge in something. So the former way would be a very literal translation. But when we translate as I take refuge in, it's very unambiguous about what the meaning is. And this is just something to keep in mind when we have to translate. Now, if we delve a little into the meaning of this, I think it's very interesting. Like, why would we repeat this? Why would we actually ever chant this? One thing that's important to keep in mind is we aren't going to the historical Buddha for shelter. The Buddha has passed beyond the sight of gods and people. We are going to enlightenment. We are going to awakening. That is the shelter, the protection that we're looking for. That's the whole goal of Buddhism, is for us to become Buddhas. That's what we have first in our minds. That's the goal. But if we're not just immediately, we could be a Pachika Buddha. We might be privately awakened, might be born that way. If we're not in a state of awakenedness, of enlightenment, then we need to know how to get there. We have to go to the teaching of the historical Buddha. We go to the teaching in order to arrive at enlightenment. But for there to be a teaching, there needs to be a community of people who are interested in becoming awakened and interested in transmitting the teaching. So I think that's the best way to understand this taking refuge. It's not the only way to understand it. And if you, dear listener, have a different understanding, please share. I would love to hear about your understanding and experience of this journey. And on that note, we will wrap up for the day. Peace, everyone.